Hey everyone, Cody Hayes here, and I'd like to welcome you to part 5 as we look at the Gospel of Luke. And we left off, getting into the parable of the Good Samaritan that's found in the Gospel of Luke. And I gave a little bit of background of who the Samaritans are. And I'll mention that, if you want to see a lot of how Judaism was practiced during the lifetime of Jesus, go attend a Shabbat, a Sabbath on Mount Gerizim, because the Samaritans, they maintain the priestly system. The Jewish people don't have that anymore because the priestly system was tied up heavily with the temple in Jerusalem, and there is no longer a temple. But in the parable of the Good Samaritan, the two Jews in the story, excuse me, were the bad guys, while the Samaritan was the good guy, and be like the Good Samaritan. So, to kind of emphasize that point, I'm actually going to read here from the story of the Good Samaritan. Just then, a lawyer stood up to test Jesus. "Teacher," he said, "what must I do to inherit eternal life?" He said to him, "What is written in the law? What do you read there?" He answered, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your strength, and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself." And he said to him, "You have given the right answer. Do this and you will live." But wanting to justify himself, he asked Jesus, "And who is my neighbor?" Jesus replied, "A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho and fell into the hands of robbers who stripped him, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. Now by chance a priest was going down that road, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. So likewise a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, while traveling, came near him, and when he saw him, he was moved with pity. He went to him and bandaged his wounds, having poured oil and wine on them. Then he put him on his own animal, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day he took out 2 denarii, gave them to the innkeeper, and said, "Take care of him, and when I come back I will repay you whatever more you spend." Which of these 3 do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of the robbers? He said, "The one who showed him mercy." Jesus said to him, "Go and do likewise." So, essentially in the story, the 2 Jews were the bad guys. They didn't help the individual who was beaten, while the Samaritan was the good guy. And why that would have a lot of, impact on Jesus's audience is that Jews and Samaritans don't get along with one another, but in this story, the Samaritan was the good guy, and it also deflects what is known as the logical/rhetorical fallacy of the no true Scotsman, which is basically the understanding how nobody in my group would ever behave in such a manner. That's the other group, that's the other people. Where, no, in this case, the 2 Jewish people, they weren't the good guys. The Samaritan was the good guy, and be like the Samaritan. So moving forward, we have here some hyperbole statements, traditional meanings, and an additional meaning. "If anyone comes to me who does not hate," etc., etc., etc. There's a number of bits, with that passage, but I think of, "If anyone comes to me who does not hate their mother, their father, their children, their brothers or sisters, even their own life, they can't be my disciple." Basically, kind of the heart of that. Well, The traditional understanding is that those statements are hyperbole language, that is, exaggeration to make a point, to emphasize that God is to be first in a person's life. So that's the traditional understanding that, it's hyperbole language. It's not meant to be taken literally that you're supposed to actually, hate your parents or your siblings, et cetera, but it's to emphasize that God has to be above those things. But perhaps an additional meaning was Jesus actually thinking more about a heavenly family than an earthly one? So again, the traditional understanding of that passage is that, it's not meant to be taken literally, but it's to emphasize that God needs to be first in a person's life. But historians have wondered, could Jesus really be thinking more of a heavenly family than an earthly one? And certainly many Gnostic Christians would answer that question with a yes. We're moving into the Passion narrative. Judas Iscariot betrays Jesus with a kiss. And it's in this particular gospel, Luke, where Judas kisses Jesus, and that's when Jesus responds back in the way that probably you'll see in a lot of plays or movies. He responds back, Judas, you betrayed the Son of Man with a kiss, or your master with a kiss. So Jesus, he's brought to and he's condemned before the Sanhedrin, and Luke's account is arguably the most historically accurate. So in the Synoptics, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Jesus is brought before the Sanhedrin. He's not brought before the Sanhedrin in John. John has a different account of that. But Luke's account is arguably the most historically accurate because the meeting takes place during the day, and when Jesus is questioned, rather than agree, state yes, like in the case he's asked, are you the Son of God? Whereas in Mark's gospel, he says, I am. But in Luke's gospel, he states, you say so. Well, Jesus, he's then taken before Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor of Judea. Pilate questions him. He finds no basis to go forward, but on the insistence of the chief priests and the elders, Pilate sends Jesus to be tried before Herod Antipas, who was the tetrarch of Galilee. And I'm going to have a sip of water here real quick. So, who exactly was Herod Antipas? Well, he was the son of Herod the Great, who, of course, Herod the Great was the client king of Israel and was the individual involved in the Christmas account, heavily in Matthew's gospel. He's referenced only in passing in Luke. Um, but upon Herod's death, his kingdom was essentially divided up among his survivors. And so Herod Antipas, he becomes the tetrarch. That is, essentially, he rules a quarter of what was once Herod's kingdom, and he is the ruler of Galilee. And Herod Antipas, just happened to be in Jerusalem for the Passover festival. And so when Pilate, hears that Jesus is from Nazareth, from Galilee, he's like, well, go try him before Herod. Herod's here in town. Send him there. So Jesus is taken before Herod, Herod Antipas. This is found only in Luke. And Herod questions him. Jesus remains silent. Herod Herod mocks him, and he essentially dresses him in a splendid robe, kind of mocking the notion of, guess you could say, Jesus being, king of the Jews, and sends him back to Pilate. So Jesus, he's brought back to Pilate, and in the prisoner exchange with Barabbas, he is sentenced to be crucified. So, really, no different overall from what you would read in Mark or Matthew. But you do have here the story that's known with the good thief, Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. And that's what the bottom drawing represents, the image here of Jesus being crucified with the two criminals, the two thieves, and one of them, who's the one depicted on Jesus's left, although in this particular image it would show it being, looking at the right, but from Jesus's perspective, the crucifixion would be on his left. Um, you have the one thief basically stating, you know, if you're the Son of God, save us, save yourself and us. And then the other one, who has the halo over his head, is like, well, don't you fear God? We deserve to die for what we did, but not this man. He didn't do anything wrong. And that's when he says, Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. And Jesus informs him, on this day you shall be with me in paradise. In terms of law of traditional theology, the good thief, as it's known here, received what's known as a baptism of desire. Well, I think that we will stop here, but when we come back, there's one more point to reference, and that shouldn't take too long, but I will symbolically see you then.